Have you ever read a book before that just absolutely changed the way that you looked at fiction in general? Maybe a specific narrative device was used, or maybe it was just a certain way it made you feel because the way the story was structured and the way that it was framed. Maybe it could just be a twist that happened, something you didn't quite expect. I've got 3 today that I want to share with you guys, and I have a feeling you've probably read at least one of them. Greetings, Cosmic Traveler. My name is J. Fitzpatrick Malden, and I am an author of character-driven hard science fiction and fantasy, most recently of the Foundry series, which is a story about first contact gone wrong. And in this video, we're going to be talking about 3 stories that really changed the way that I feel that I look at my writing, the way I look at storytelling, and gave me some interesting lenses through which I've been able to actually take inspiration. And so without further ado, let's jump in. Now, I know many of you are going to end up putting down in the comments as we go through this and as we talk about these different stories, you're going to have your own opinion on a particular story that maybe was huge and transformational to you as well. And what I want you to do is I want you to put down in the comments if there's a story that the narrative device to it, or it had a really big twist, or there was something about the story's structure itself that changed the way that you looked at things. Please leave that in the comments below. We would love to see what that is. First up on my list, and this is definitely not the first book or book series to have an anti-hero, but I really like the way that this was framed up, and this guy has stuck with me for years and years and years, and has lived in the back of my mind of his tragic story, of how he became who he was, and the fact that in the end, things still didn't turn out that great for him. And so I submit to you Galacta, which is from The Blade itself. This is the first of the First Law books by Joe Abercrombie. And Joe Abercrombie is well known for creating these amazing grim dark stories with very layered and complicated characters that do some really terrible and horrible things, and yet for some reason you find that you are just rooting for them all the way throughout. Now, the main character of the First Law, which is Logan Ninefingers, is definitely in that same category of a tragic character that has some terrible things about him. However, Galacta, for whatever reason, really hit me in the heart, and I feel like his story was incredibly compelling. So before we go too far into this character, I'm going to read a line from the First Law.
This is from Sandan Galacta. Every man has his excuses, and the more vile the man becomes, the more touching the story has to be. What is my story now?
So for those who haven't read the grimdark fantasy series The First Law, or read The Blade itself, or anything by Joe Abercrombie, Galacta is a former hero within this country that is called the Union, or this kingdom which is referred to as the Union. And he was a hero in war. He stood up for justice. He fought for his side, and eventually what ended up happening is he ended up having a tiff between him and a close friend of his, a friend/rival of his. He ends up going into a particular battle, first and foremost, where he ends up being captured by the enemy. Now, after he's captured by the enemy, 2 years go by that he is tortured by them, and when he is finally released, escaped, that's the part I couldn't find back in my notes again. When he actually gets out of that situation, he ends up carrying a lot of scars with him on both his body and on his soul. And so Galacta has a limp now, he can barely get around, but he also has missing teeth and he can't see right. And there's just a lot of physical ailments that he has. And upon returning to his kingdom, they don't see him the way that they used to see him. He used to be this great looking, charming guy. All the ladies loved him. All the men wanted to be him. And now he's just a stupid cripple. And so left with no other options, he ends up enacting the same kind of violence that was enacted upon him on others for the betterment of the Union. And so he joins the Inquisition, and he becomes very high up as far as in their Inquisitioners, and he ends up torturing people to get information out of them. Now, as the story goes on, Galacta is not a great person. He doesn't do a lot of great things, but at the same time, there's a part of him that you can see the kernel of humanity. Not once in the story does Galacta look at his role as one of pleasure. He does not see this in a sadistic standpoint, but rather as a necessary evil in order to reach the various goals it is that he has before him. And so what Abercrombie gives us is a lot of heartfelt moments actually with Glocta, which sounds very weird considering he's torturing everybody. However, because of that, because of the complicated nature of what this character is, it really changed the way I looked at many characters. Now, of course, in film, in sci-fi, of course, we have, say, the Riddick character from Chronicles of Riddick. We've got, Pitch Black, we have Chronicles of Riddick, and then we have the third Riddick movie, which is just Riddick, and it's Vin Diesel's character. He's a killer. He's a part of this race called the Furians, but at the same time, he's a certain type of evil, but he is not a prime evil. He is not one that is going to subject an entire civilization. He just kind of wants to be left alone. And so some of the interesting things about Glocta's character by the end of this, although he's this huge anti-hero and all these adventures happen throughout the entire series, most of his taking place back in the actual Union itself, not off on the big quests that the main characters take on. But in the end, it kind of comes full circle and nothing really ends up changing for him. Because you see, what ends up happening is, but there are also some scenes with him, with the torturing, because of course Joe Abercrombie, where he ends up clipping off a guy's, at least that's what anyway, that is a very upsetting and unsettling scene. I want to say there's also a scene where he ends up feeding people to the pigs. There's a guy that he's going up against and he feeds them to the pigs. If you can remind me on that one, put it down in the comments, because I want to say that that's true. But we've got an anti-hero in Sandane Glocta, and I absolutely love how vile he is. Side note, Joe Abercrombie was really cool. He was at a book signing here in Atlanta, and I was able to get him to sign my copy of The Blade itself, as well as he was here to sign The Devils, and this is just a beautiful and wonderful book. So if you haven't read The Devils, you should definitely check it out. It's great. And there we are as well. So thanks so much, Joe. I appreciate you. These books are amazing. And so second on my list is going to be a change in POV. It is not uncommon in a book for them to change, between different characters, for us to go from this character in this place to this character in this place, or two in the same places. Like I've seen it, in some stories where it's like, we've got a guy's perspective, we've got the girl's perspective, and then we've got the king over here's perspective, and then we got the brigand over here's perspective. It's not uncommon in books for us to skip between different POVs. However, when you have a book that is mostly from one particular POV and told in one particular voice, and then all of a sudden that shifts at some point in the book, you know that this is a moment you really need to pay attention to. Now, what I'm talking about in POV is this space is when we're talking about, say, like first person, we're talking second person, or we're talking third person, or even omniscient. Although I'm not a huge fan of omniscient, it really has to be done right. And so first person being, I say this, I walk into the room, I. It means that we are seeing through the eyes of our main character the entire time. Now, when we're talking about third person, and third person limited is probably one of the most popular in writing, is to say like, Patrick walked into a room and he picked up a cup of coffee and took a sip, and then Patrick has some dialogue or whatever it may be. And so that's a very popular one. But there's one I don't see very often. And this particular one never really feels quite right unless it's used at exactly the right moment. And so let's talk about second person. But not just second person as in throughout the whole book. Let's talk about second person in a very specific case. And so the second one we're going to talk about is Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which, gosh, guys, this book is so good. And so I'll just read real quick out of the dust jacket for those who may not be familiar. In this exhilarating novel by best-selling author of The Storied Life of A.J. Filkry, two friends, often in love but never lovers, come together as creative partners in the world of video game design, where success brings them fame, joy, tragedy, duplicity, and ultimately a kind of immortality. Now, the book is a whole lot more than this. This is very much a life story. This is very much It's funny, this was actually recommended to me by someone in my professional career outside of writing, and they took it as a story of resilience when really bad things happen in life, and I can see that. But I'm going to use my own description on this that I put there to give you a little bit more. And I said that it was really a literary fiction about video game developers who were friends and a traumatic event brought on by echo chambers online becoming a sort of petri dish for culture and war and hatred online. Regardless of how you feel on any particular issues, one of the biggest challenges we have online is these spaces, even like this, create these kind of echo chambers that self-reinforce things that may or may not be true. When the things are true, it's a good thing for us to continue to be reinforced on it. But when they're not, or maybe when all the context is taken out because the format doesn't allow you to expand upon that context, it can create a lot of issues and can end up challenging people from a mental health standpoint. Now, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about in this segment, but I think that this book has a lot to say, and I think it is beautifully written, so it's a great job to that, Gabrielle. That said, without trying to go through and tell you what happens when that is one of the hardest parts of the book. But shortly after that, there's a sequence that happens that elevated me. And even though I was at a very low point at that part of the book, it took me out of the sequence and it made me feel different than I'd ever felt before. Section 7 of the book, starting on, it's not exactly a chapter, but let's say page 283 in this particular edition, which I listened to this on audio, but my wife has the Book of the Month edition, is why I have this one right here. It goes the entire book from being in a third-person narrative, going between the different characters to all of a sudden, we're in second person. And so I'll read a small excerpt so that you can see how this feels. You are flying. Below a checkerboard of country life, a pair of Jersey cows graze in a lavender field, tails swatting at imaginary flies. A woman in a chambray dress rides a bicycle over a stone bridge. She hums the second movement of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, and as she passes, a man in a Breton cap begins whistling the tune. From a hive you cannot see the susurrus of bees. In the valley below the bridge, an ink-haired boy feeds a sugar cube to a horse with a wild look in its eyes. A grove of apple trees wait patiently for fall. Unobserved, a graying man watches two teenagers swim in a pond. You can smell the man's longing, stronger than lavender, and you think, humans want so much. I'm so glad to be a bird. In a field of strawberry plants, waxy berries companionably mingle among the white flowers. You have never been one to resist a strawberry, so you descend. So not only does it skip from the perspective of being in third person the entire time, we're saying they are doing this, they are doing that, with that particular character of whoever you're in at the moment. It goes to this second person narrative where even the character isn't the same character anymore. You're actually left that entire sequence, which is pretty drawn out, kind of trying to figure out whose eyes that you're seeing through. Now, I definitely don't want to give you any spoilers, but there is an amazing concept also that's explored in this, and it's around grief and tragedy, to where when we're very close to people, the memories of them kind of end up becoming this little program that runs in the back of our mind for the rest of our life. And so we almost make this sort of like model of them, like call it, it's almost kind of like an AI model in a way, but we create this model of them in the back of our mind. And I do believe that's what people are talking about when they say they live on in your heart. However it is they impacted us, whatever experiences that they gave us that enriched our life, we do carry those with us. And that person does kind of live on, and that's a big theme of what gets explored in that. And then the way it gets translated through this narrative device is just magical. I can't say I didn't draw inspiration from this for the third book of the Foundry series, The Tempering. There's a sequence that is, let's just say it's less than linear, and I make a major shift between different perspectives and points of view so that you can see the main character in a different, what's the word I'm trying to look for? In an altered state of consciousness, which I think translates really well throughout. But at the end of the day, if I had done the same thing through the entire book, or if the entire book of Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow had been that, it would have been far less effective. So yeah, we don't have a signed copy of this one, but if you ever want to sign it for me, Gabrielle, I'll absolutely let you sign it. It's such an amazing book. The third book, and this one I don't have a physical copy of because I listened to it on audio and it was amazingly done, is Harrow the Ninth. Now, Harrow the Ninth is part of the Locked Tomb series, which follows the story of characters such as Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth, and they are these necromantic warriors who also have a cavalier that follows them around, and it very much gives me some Wheel of Time with the Aes Sedai and the Warden kind of setup. You know, you've got your spellcaster and then you've got your sword-wielding defender. However, completely different. In the first book of the Locked Tomb series, and we're talking of Gideon the Ninth, as a locked room mystery. So they are sent out to this place, they are all locked into it, and they're all trying to figure out how to become this thing called a lector. And once their necromancer becomes a lector, like they're super powerful and they can do all these things on the behalf of their necromantic god. But while they're there, there's all these little mysteries and rooms and things they're trying to unlock, and there are these horrors in the building, and you as the reader are trying to figure it out as people are dropping left and right. Some of them you like, some of them you don't. I can't spoil the first book if you're going to read this. However, let's just say a terrible event happens at the end of the first book, which creates the situation for the narrative device we're talking in the second. And so now let's go back to that whole second person shift that I was talking about. The second book in the Locked Tomb series, which is going to be Harrow the Ninth, starts off in second person. Now, because I was just listening to the preview at first, I was like, oh my gosh, is this going to be how the whole book goes? And it absolutely does not. What the second person perspective ends up achieving throughout this, which I think is really cool, is again, it goes to show an altered state of consciousness. And so there is a particular character, let's say that they are trapped in a particular place and they cannot express themselves, and they're expressing themselves through this altered perception. So when we're in this second person state, we're actually seeing a different person entirely, but you don't know whose eyes you're looking through. It's been a while since I've read this, but I want to say Tamsin Muir said something about how this was written, and essentially that it led to, it was connected to mental health, and she was trying to show a perspective of that, of when you're kind of losing your identity, and I think it was very, very effective for the books. Now, Locked Tomb may or may not be your speed, but I can tell you one thing about her style in general is it's remarkable, it's lyrical, and it's kind of hallucinogenic in a way, is all that I know how to put that. And so it kind of felt like you were taking drugs for a while, that something is not right with your mind, and nobody was on drugs, but there sure was a lot of magic and a lot of weird brain effery going on. And so 5 out of 5 would definitely recommend jumping into that. However, book 1 and book 2 are very different thematically because, like I said, book 1 is more of a locked room mystery. Book 2 is more like your kind of standard fantasy adventure, but not standard at all because we're falling into a river that takes us through hell, so we can travel through space to be able to fight giant remnants with necromantic powers so that they don't destroy humanity or what's left of it. And there's people like fighting these wars, and then maybe the main characters become best friends with God. I don't know. I still have a lot of questions. Okay, and I forgot the whole thing because look guys, I'm new to this whole YouTube thing. I have been posting on here for years, putting up little videos, but I never really had like a format to what I did. And so we're working this out. We're trying to figure out new ways to do this. So please do me a favor. If you like any of this content at all, and then just like or subscribe, leave us a comment, let us know that you're enjoying it, because honestly, I love going deep into stories and storytelling and talking about how they stir us as human beings. And this is kind of a lot of fun. Some other honorable mentions in the space of interesting storytelling, new narrative devices to me. I'm going to mention a few in the film space. For example, the movie Wall-E. The first 20 minutes or so leading that first act of the story, leading up to the jump into 2 with the second act, there's almost no dialogue. I believe there is a song and there is a little background atmospheric storytelling with the whole by and large signs, but other than that, Wall-E says nothing, the cockroach says nothing, and really we don't go into that next part until the spaceship lands. This is highly effective in that it doesn't distract us from what's going on around Wall-E, and we can see the ruined landscape of Earth, how terrible things have become, and it ends up leaving this very heavy, dramatic feel on top of you through the entire sequence. Another great movie that followed something similar is 28 Days Later. Main character wakes up in kind of a hospital situation. He goes and stumbles outside, the world is a mess, and in the background there's this noise that just keeps getting louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, all the way up until the end of that first little climax, and it ends up creating massive amounts of tension where you're like, I really want to know what comes next. Now, of course, the twist is always a great thing, and according to the story grid, and I think this is a great model for this, a twist should feel both surprising and inevitable, meaning you didn't see it coming, but it totally makes sense. So it wouldn't be like a pony all of a sudden jumps up and is like, hey, I'm a vampire. Like, that would be a little weird if you didn't set that up in some other way. However, let's say the ending of Sixth Sense is a great example of that. Yeah, Bruce Willis's character's been dead the whole time. Sorry for anybody who hasn't seen the movie yet. I may have ruined something for you. In fairness, it did come out like in the 90s, so it's okay, right? Of course, other great twists like we talked about in our last video. The Matrix has a massive twist. And most recently, even in the video game space, guys, Expedition 33, if you haven't played it yet, oh my God. I'm not gonna ruin it for you, but let's just say, that kind of has a really big twist. Bugged my wife for a few of her recent books that had some interesting devices that she felt was, and one of them was called Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. And she said that this was a book within a book, that as the story goes on, apparently they are also unfolding a book that the main character, one of the characters, wrote, which I find fascinating. Another story to do that pretty well was also The Dark Tower by Stephen King. There's a whole sequence in that where essentially the sequel to Salem's Lot lives inside the Dark Tower. Also another big twist from Dark Tower, I can't tell it, but let's just say one of the pillars that holds up creation may also be a man named Stephen King. A book that really captivated my wife as well, that she ended up doing a little bit of research on as she went through, was called, and let me refer back to my notes, We Used to Live Here by Marcus Klewer. Now, the interesting thing that happened is there's messages that go throughout the book that are in Morse code, and the Morse code is actually listed in the book. I can remember when she was reading it, she was going through and actually trying to figure out what the Morse code messages were, which was kind of a fun little Easter egg. So then the question really is, what book, what TV show, what story have you seen or have you read recently, or in any time at all that had some sort of interesting narrative device that kind of changed the way you looked at storytelling or gave you a certain feeling you had never felt before in a particular story? Leave it down in the comments, guys. I would love to know. Thanks again for watching, and safe journeys, Cosmic Traveler. We'll see you next time.